Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Rajat Sanyal of the Department of Archaeology, University of Calcutta. Today we'll be discussing the module on the evolution of North Indian scripts from Brahmi under the paper Indian Epigraphy. The learning objectives of this module are to look at the development from early to middle Brahmi, regionalization and other developments in late Brahmi, characteristics of late Brahmi, genesis of proto-regional scripts, and finally, the Siddhamatrika and its chronological varieties. We begin with early Brahmi, which was earlier called Ashokan Brahmi or Maurya Brahmi because all the inscriptions were believed to be written by the Maurya king Ashok, but later it was called early Brahmi by D.C. Sarkar, who suggested that since many other ruling lineages or individual donations were made during the phase when this particular Brahmi script was written between the 3rd and the 1st century BCE, we should not assign any dynastic emblem on it, and rather we should name it in terms of a general terminology called early Brahmi. And the structure of the early Brahmi shows that this was the uniform monumental script of the Ashokan period, of which the general structure looks like this. This is the famous Rumindai pillar inscription of the time of Ashok, and here one can see the monumental uniform characteristic of early Brahmi that actually characterized the entire gamut of Ashokan inscriptions in the 3rd century BC and continued throughout the 2nd and the 1st century BCE. The major factors that affected the evolution of Brahmi from the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century BCE were the decline of the Maurya polity, the gradual appearance of Sanskrit as epigraphic language, growth of provincial political cultures, variation in content and purpose of inscriptions, and most importantly, new developments in Greek paleography. Here we can see in the coins of the Indo-Greek rulers, we have certain symbols of letters that witnessed a particular line of development around the 2nd and the 1st century BC. If we take the cases of sigma, omicron and omega, we see a sharp feature of angularity, a squarization of the letters and broadening of the outline of the letters are taking place, and these were the most important factors, of course, besides the issue of a new element in the letter forms, that is a dot at the beginning or at the end of the letters, suggesting the use of a new style that we will later discuss. If we compare the monumental script of Rumindai and the later 2nd century BCE script found in the famous Besnagar inscriptions from central India, we can clearly see 3 developmental features: the squarization of the aksharas, the angularity of the aksharas, and finally the emergence of new phonemes. We can see that letters like sa and pa are prominently becoming squarer in shape, in outline, than the earlier rectangular forms. And finally, in the 1st century BCE, we find, as here in the Hathigumpha inscription of the time of Kharavela, the famous Hathigumpha inscriptions found from the Udayagiri hills and Udayagiri caves in Odisha, Bhubaneswar, we can see the final development of this middle Brahmi script from early Brahmi. And the factors that actually resulted into the formation of the middle Brahmi script from early Brahmi were firstly the introduction of a new style which is called the pen style by A.H. Dani. Here we can see in both the Indo-Greek coins and in the early donations from Mathura, the use of the pen style reflected in the inscriptions. This was a reed style of pen with which one can hold control over the thickness of lines, and because of this, the upper portion of all the letters were thick and the lower portions of the letters were gradually thinner in outline. The same pen style also resulted in the formation of a blot at the top of the letter that actually finally will form the matra or the head mark of a letter that had its root at this stage of development of Brahmi. And the results of these were the introduction of several new symbols, the introduction of a number of different types of head marks, introduction of varying medial vowels, as well as the development of regional styles, and this last development was the most important factor behind the evolution of Brahmi script. Now if we look at the regional styles, Ahmed Hasan Dani has shown that as many as 6 different regional styles of writing had developed by 1st century BCE or 1st century CE in different parts of India. These were at Mathura, in the northwestern part of India, in central India, in northwestern Deccan, in eastern India, and in southern India. These regional styles developed their own idioms of writing Brahmi scripts. The development of the Middle Brahmi thus was the result of a number of political, social, and cultural factors that resulted into the formation of a script that would look completely different from what we saw in early Brahmi, as we can see here in the structure of the Middle Brahmi, general structure of the Middle Brahmi script. This Middle Brahmi continued from the 1st century CE till the 4th century CE with a second stage of evolution into the late Brahmi script. And the characteristics of this late Brahmi script were the introduction of more newer symbols, fondness of flourish by the composers who wrote the inscriptions, diverse material used for the writing of inscriptions resulting in different forms, and most importantly, the formation of a cursive style, the localized idiom of writing Brahmi. These characterized late Brahmi around early 4th century CE. If we look at the examples, the first one was the introduction of different new types of head marks. Ahmed Hasan Dani has shown at least 9 different types of head marks prevalent in different parts of the country, and he grouped them into 2. If we look at the first group, there are 5 different varieties of the head mark with a gradually slanting line and a triangular wedge at the top. And then we have a straight horizontal bar acting as the head mark, and then we have a solid box acting as the head mark, and then we have a solid square box as head mark, then have a hollow square box as head mark. In the second group again, we have 4 different types of head marks, like the triangular wedge, the notch-shaped head mark, the solid triangular head mark, and the hollow triangular head mark. Likely, we have now in the script, Brahmi script, the extensive tendency of ornamenting the letter forms, as we can see here from inscriptions of different parts of the country, that the medial vowels are being formed with somewhat unnecessary ornamentation of the letter forms, and this resulted into the formation of not only late Brahmi, but this was also the general characteristic of late Brahmi from 4th century CE onwards. And finally, we can see that several different types of scripts in different parts of the country are appearing, and this is the most important issue behind the evolution of not only Brahmi script but any script, which should be gradually and continuously regionalized in having diverse shapes, as it happened with Brahmi also. And the resultant was a complete change of the script form from the early till the late Brahmi script. From 4th century onwards, we see further regionalization of the Brahmi script. Ahmed Hasan Dani suggested that around 5th century CE, we had at least 9 to 10 different regional scripts prevalent in different parts of the country. These were in the Indus zone, in the Mathura area, the Sanchi area, the Kaushambi area, the eastern Indian plains, the inner Madhya Pradesh area, the eastern Malwa region, the northeastern Rajasthan, and the southeastern Deccan region. Here you can see now an individual region is producing its own idiom of a particular script. And this was the manifestation of the actual evolution of the script of Brahmi. If we look at the structure of the late Brahmi, it would look somewhat like this. And if we compare this with what we saw in early Brahmi, or middle Brahmi, it is a completely different type of script. Here, in the 4th century or 5th century CE Brahmi, we see that unlike the earlier types of ligatures and consonantal conjuncts which were written in a particular set of formulae as in the Ashokan inscriptions, here we have a diverse types of conjuncts and ligatures which do not fall under specified formulae. For each of the letters, one has to have a completely different graph of the script. This is because not only the script is changing, but also the language is continuously changing. From 1st century CE onwards, Sanskrit was introduced as one of the major epigraphic languages, and by 4th century BC, it was the language of writing inscriptions in India. And by that time also epigraphical hybrid Sanskrit or EHS had developed. That resulted into the formation of a large number of new sounds in Sanskrit. And these sounds have to be reproduced in the inscriptions. And for that, the composers of the inscriptions needed to form new symbols, not within a specified formulae as in the Ashokan inscriptions, but according to the necessity of the sounds that they were actually engraving on the stone or copper. And besides, as I already said, there were the factors like use of different types of materials, not only the stone but also metal, brick, terracotta, and other different types of materials were being now used for writing inscriptions. We see the final manifestation of the late Brahmi script in some major Middle Ganga Valley Gupta inscriptions like the Allahabad pillar inscription, or as in this slide, the Kahaum inscription of the time of Skandagupta, dated in the middle of the 5th century CE. Here you can see all the characteristic features that characterize late Brahmi appearing on stone. Firstly, the head mark, the solid triangular head mark characterizes all the letters of this inscription. Secondly, the controllable line can be clearly seen here, as all the horizontal and vertical elements of the letters are gradually getting thin at the tail and starts as a broad thick line at the top. Thirdly, we can see that all the letters are gradually becoming square in shape. In fact, in this inscription, they are absolutely square in shape, unlike the earlier or early Brahmi rectangular outline of the script. This is another interesting evidence of 6th century late Brahmi script, which is found from the Barabar hills in Bihar and dated in the middle of the 6th century CE. Here, unlike the previous inscription, we see that the head marks are not triangular wedge-shaped solid head marks, but here the head marks are solid boxes, solid rectangular boxes. This characterized late Brahmi of eastern India as early as the 6th century, as evidenced from this inscription. Secondly, here also we see that the letters are becoming absolutely square in outline. Therefore, the general characteristic of late Brahmi of squarization of the letters is also visible here. Secondly, finally, the angularity of the script, as we can see here, all the letter forms have a clearly angular structure. If we look at the outline of all the letters, they have a clear angular structure. Next, if we see the medial vowels, here also we have extensive variation of medial vowels even within a single regional style. Then we can think of the variety of medial vowels employed in late Brahmi inscriptions if we consider the entire range of different regional styles of this script. Now, if we look at the actual change, the systemic change, what is a systemic change? Systemic change is a complete change in the character of the script. For example, if you take a snap of one of the scripts, say early Brahmi, and if you compare that snap with that of the middle Brahmi, these two will be completely different snaps. Likewise, if you take a snap of the middle Brahmi script and then compare it with late Brahmi, there will be different snaps. Not only individual paleographic characteristics are considered in understanding systemic change, but also the overall structure of the script is compared. And if we find that these two structures are completely different from each other, then we call it a systemic change. If we see here, if we look at the first structure and then compare it with the second one, we find that these two are completely different from each other. The same is with the second and the third structures, which are completely separated from each other. So, if we look at the first table, the structure represented in that table, and then if we compare this with the second table, they are two completely different structures. Likewise, if we look at the second table and then compare this with the third one, they will again look completely different from each other. And this is what A.H. Dani has called and other paleographists have called the systemic change. Thus, from the 3rd century BC till the 4th, 5th century CE, we have a concrete line of evolution with diverse regional trends of systemic change in Brahmi script, first achieved around 1st century CE or 1st century BC, what has been called the Middle Brahmi script, and its second stage evolved around 4th century or 5th century CE, called the Late Brahmi. From 4th century, 5th century CE, there is again another strain of development from Brahmi to its later developments. From 6th century CE, Brahmi stepped into its next phase of development, as we can see here in the Hara inscription of Ishana Varman, dated in 554 CE. Here, unlike all the earlier Brahmi scripts, starting from the early to the late Brahmi, here we can see that new forms are again developing, but in a completely different manner. Here we can see all the medial vowels and ligatures which are part of the lower portion of a letter. They have an elongated shape, which is not characteristic of any of its predecessors in India. Therefore, it marks a new beginning again from late Brahmi to the evolution of what we will call the proto-regional scripts. Of the proto-regional scripts, the most important is the script called Siddha Matrika. When we compare the volume of researches on early scripts, that on the vast varieties of proto-regional scripts of the subcontinent appearing from the 7th century CE onwards is admittedly insufficient. This is particularly because after the discovery of the Harappa civilization, much researchers have undergone the origin and decipherment of the still unknown Harappan script and also the other early scripts of India, but the proto-regional scripts have mostly been neglected. If we look at the early notices of these proto-regional scripts, a large number of inscriptions in copper, stone and terracotta datable from the 7th century CE onwards were found, and these formed the earliest set of proto-regional scripts. Early paleographists like James Burgess, J. Fleet and A.C. Burnell and George Wooler, they started dividing these later proto-regional scripts found on various inscriptions into northern and southern geographical varieties. Fleet termed it Kutila, since the right vertical element of the letters become, in this style of writing, bent, that is Kutila, outwards to further right. Wooler termed it, on almost the same ground, acute angled or early Nagari script. We should be grateful to the 11th century Arab traveler who came to India in 1030 CE, named Abu Rayhan al-Biruni, because he is the only scholar on India in the historical periods who has talked on the different styles of writing of the early medieval period. We have several Buddhist and Jain texts that talk of different types of scripts of the early historic period, but al-Biruni's account is the only source for understanding or for having information on the names of different early medieval and medieval scripts of India. Al-Biruni talked of a number of scripts like Siddhamatrika, Nagara, Ardhanagari, Malwari, Saindhava, Karnata, Dirwari, which is of course Dravidi, and Lari. Most interesting is Nagara, which is actually the Nagari script. And then two more scripts called Gaudi or Bhaikshuki, Gaudi and Bhaikshuki. Of these, the two scripts prevalent in the eastern country according to al-Biruni were the Gaudi and the Bhaikshuki. The third script called Siddhamatrika had a wide area of distribution, including eastern India. The name Siddhamatrika, as recorded by al-Biruni, was first reconstructed by D.C. Sarkar categorically, although George Wooler had called the headmarks of these letters as Matrika, of course based on al-Biruni's account, but it was D.C. Sarkar who categorically suggested that al-Biruni was responsible for informing us about the names of the scripts, as we can see here in the quotation from D.C. Sarkar, who suggested that in North India, the regional alphabets developed from Brahmi of the late stage through a distinct step. The alphabets of this intermediate stage may be styled Siddhamatrika. The name Siddhamatrika is more authoritative since al-Biruni, 11th century AD, uses this name for the alphabets of certain regions, and the Chinese applied the same name Siddham to the same script. On the basis of fine spots of different inscriptions written in this script, we can have a tentative geographical boundary of the distribution or spread of the Siddhamatrika script. As we can see here, almost the entire northern Indian segment of the subcontinent was the area where Siddhamatrika script was in continuous use. A.H. Dani has recently tried to locate the status of the Siddhamatrika script in the general scheme of proto-regional scripts of India. As we can see here, there are four different proto-regional scripts prevalent in India from the 7th century CE, and of these, the first and foremost was northern India, the rest being Gujarat, Rajasthan and central India, the third being Deccan, and the fourth being South India. Of these, the first category, that is northern India, here we see that of the northern Indian scripts, we have another segment in eastern India, and then another segment in Middle Ganga Valley. The Siddhamatrika stood as the script of both Middle Ganga Valley and eastern India of the northern Indian variety of proto-regional scripts. Now, if we look at the systemic features of this script, we find further development of flourish that initiated in the Gupta period, more distinct cursive tendency, again further variation in the formation of medial vowels, a number of acute angles being formed at the right vertical angle of all the letters, the development of the matra, and also, nevertheless significantly, the introduction of the non-Indo-Aryan languages that necessitated the use of different new symbols for the script. The stylized developments of the Middle Ganga Valley can be seen here, like the formation of the acute angle at the end of the letters, the stylized use of the medial vowels, and again the controlled tapering, gradually thinning line of each of the letters. Here we can see graphically the characteristics of the acute angle and the matra. All the vertical development of the acute angle and the matra. All the letters have their vertical element forming an acute angle with the horizontal plane, as you can see to the left, and to the right is the formation of the matra from two different head marks of the two vertical elements of a letter. Here we can see a single head mark or serif, which is actually now acting as a matra, is being formed. The two head marks of the two separate elements of the vertical lines of the letters are now joined to form a matra. And the normalized structure of this Siddhamatrika will finally look like this. This is the famous Bhaskara inscription of Harshavardhan dated in the 7th century CE, which is famous for having shown us the evidence of Harshavardhana's so-called Harshavardhana's signature, which is actually a demonstration of how the composers were proficient in exhibiting all the characteristic features of the Siddhamatrika script, starting from the flourish to the ornamentation to the formation of the matra and the formation of the acute angle. All the characteristics are for the first time clearly manifested in this inscription. From 8th century onwards, the Siddhamatrika had this second stage of development, which is manifested in this normalized structure of the script in the 9th century CE. These are the most frequently found ligatures and consonantal conjuncts found in the mature Siddhamatrika script of Middle Ganga Valley and Eastern India. To exemplify, we can take into consideration the most important and most recently discovered copper plate inscription of the time of the Pala ruler Mahendrapal. We can also take into consideration, apart from the longer inscriptions, these small donative inscriptions also dated in the rule of the same king, where these characteristics of the mature Siddhamatrika script are clearly visible. To summarize, thus, we have these points to be remembered. Firstly, all the modern Indian scripts developed from Brahmi. Brahmi had a continuous evolutionary development from the 3rd century BCE till date. Early Brahmi developed into Middle and Late Brahmi. Several new features and extensive regionalization characterized later forms of Brahmi. Proto-regional scripts developed from Late Brahmi. Siddhamatrika developed from Late Brahmi around 6th century or early 7th century. The name Siddhamatrika is known from Albirune's account. This is very important. And Siddhamatrika developed into Gaudi in Eastern India and into Nagari in Northern India. Thus, Siddhamatrika forming the most major and the prime script of Northern India in the early medieval period. Thank you.